I'm extremely happy that the House of Latin America in Tehran and the University of Tehran's College of Global Studies has invited me to join you at this 70th commemoration of the coup d'etat against the government of Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran. It's interesting that I'm speaking to you from Santiago, Chile, where there was also a coup d'etat in 1973, 50 years ago. This coup, of course, was against the government of Salvador Allende. Salvador Allende, of course, led the Popular Unity Coalition in Chile, was overthrown by a US green-lighted coup by General Augusto Pinochet. We're going to be talking in Chile in the next month because that coup took place on September 11th. We're going to be talking a lot about the coup against the government of Allende. There's going to be, in fact, global consideration of this coup and the 50 years that have elapsed since then. Not much is remembered, on the other hand, about the coup in Iran. Even 20 years ago, I well remember, in 2003, there was barely any conversation about the 50th anniversary of the coup against Mossadegh in Iran. Now, that was an interesting year, 2003, the year when the United States opened an illegal war against Iraq, continued to pursue its war against Afghanistan, and then began to ramp up its war or hybrid war against Iran, particularly after 2006. In that climate, people were not remembering the coup against the government of Mossadegh, democratically elected, I might say, in Iran. But we are now remembering it, and we should remember it for good reason. Both the coup against Mohammad Mossadegh, 1953 in Iran, and the coup against Salvador Allende, 1973 in Chile, both these coups were not just coups against the people of Iran and the people of Chile. They were not just coups conducted by Western countries, by the United Kingdom and the United States, but these were also coups against the broader third world. And indeed, that's the brunt of my intervention today. I want to talk about the coup in Iran in 1953 as a coup against the third world. In order to make that point, I want to lay out for you two observations. The first is going to be about the national liberation projects themselves, and the second is going to be about the tentacle nature or the tentacular nature of imperialism after World War II. Let's spend some time on the first observation, on this idea of national liberation. Countries that emerged from colonialism, such as India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Vietnam, and so on, but also countries that emerged from semi-colonialism. Iran is a good example, later China. These countries found themselves once free or freer with a significant burden. In the colonial period or the semi-colonial occupation, these countries had been forced to become merely exporters of raw materials, whether it's, let's say, rubber from Malaysia, Indonesia, oil from Iran, and so on. These countries were exporting unprocessed raw materials to the West, which would then export to these countries finished products. Now, the gap between the price of unprocessed raw materials could be cocoa in West Africa, or even gold, or again, materials from India, food products, jute, and so on. Unprocessed, largely products sold to the West, where there was industrial production to produce finished products that were sold in our countries. The gap between the price of unprocessed products and the imported finished products, that gap is known as the terms of trade, term utilized in mainstream economics, but made very important by the Argentinian economist Raul Prebisch, who was the first director of the UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD. UNCTAD and Prebisch argued that the terms of trade between exports of unprocessed raw materials, which were being exported at very low prices because of the grip of multinational corporations, the gap between the low price of exported commodities and the high price of imports meant that countries in the third world would continue to be in debt. They would continue to have to borrow from their former colonial masters, borrow money from them to pay off the high import bills, and sometimes start to pay off just the debt servicing, as is happening now in most of the world. This is the neo-colonial structure of the world economy. Prebisch wrote a lot about this, but so did a range of people in the field of dependency theory. The great Egyptian Marxist Samir Amin, of course, wrote a great deal about this. So the National Liberation Project, as it emerged in the immediate post-war period, was to try to break this bargain between selling unprocessed raw materials abroad and importing finished products. One of the first instruments of breaking this terms of trade problem was to fight to regain control over one's economy, particularly over the principal raw materials that were being exported, to fight to get a better price for them. And as countries began to try and exert their authority over the economy, they faced a challenge from their former imperial masters. After World War II, Iran was the first country really to experience this genuine battle with the West over who gets to determine who owns the raw materials in a country. Is it the people of that country or is it the multinational corporation? And not only who gets to own it, but who sets the prices. Mohammad Mossadegh was elected on a mandate of economic nationalism to basically secure the nationalization of Iranian oil and to make sure that prices of that oil was maintained at a decent level, not necessarily very high, but at a decent level. And with earning the revenues from the principal export, Iran then would have been able to set its course for an industrialization project within the country, import goods that were needed, capital goods for industrialization, not just consumer goods. That was the plan and project of the third world. In fact, not just in Iran, but in Jawaharlal Nehru's India, in Sukarno's Indonesia, in Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana, and so on. Well, by demanding the nationalization of oil fields and calling for higher prices for oil in the Iranian case, Mohammad Mossadegh went head to head with Western countries and their oil companies. And it is here that the intelligence agencies of Britain and the United States, the Central Intelligence Agency, were basically authorized to enter the Iranian sovereign space and begin to plot a coup d'etat. In fact, Kermit Roosevelt, a relative of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, former president, relative of Teddy Roosevelt, another former president, Kermit Roosevelt was sent by the CIA with $1 million to conduct the coup against Mohammad Mossadegh. That's all it took, was $1 million to overthrow the government of a sovereign country. And that's exactly what happened. Mohammad Mossadegh was overthrown in 1953. A pliant government of the Shah was brought back, and the oil companies were allowed to exploit Iranian oil as much as possible. Now, I said what happened in Iran was a coup against the third world, because it wasn't merely an Iranian story. The very next year, in distant Guatemala in Central America, the government of Jacob Arbenz tried to establish control this time over Guatemala's principal capital good, which was its land, where the United Fruit Company, a US-based agribusiness, was growing bananas and other fruit and exporting it into Western markets. Well, Jacob Arbenz said land owned by United Fruit, which is not being used, should be taken by the state and given to landless peasants, a form of agrarian reform. But Arbenz then went head to head with United Fruit, but also the US government, because it turned out several leading members of the administration in the United States held shares or were on the board of United Fruit, including the brothers John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, Allen Dulles, head of the CIA. And so, to maintain their control over the land in Guatemala, Arbenz trying to do the same thing as Mossadegh. To maintain the control of United Fruit, they conducted a coup against the government of Jacob Arbenz. Let's go to one more continent to even this out. Iran in Asia, Guatemala in Latin America. Let's go to Africa. The Congo, the largest country at the time in Africa, very large landmass, was led by a man named Patrice Lumumba, who fought against the Belgians for the independence of the Congo. But the Central Intelligence Agency was very worried about Patrice Lumumba because Lumumba, like Mossadegh, like Arbenz, was going to fight to control the resources, raw materials of the people of Congo, and in particular, a mine which produced uranium. It was from this mine in the Congo, then controlled by the Belgians, that the United States was able to get the uranium that was used in the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The United States feared not only that this independent government in the Congo, led by Patrice Lumumba, would control the uranium, but they said that this would then be given to the Soviet Union. Soviets might benefit. So to prevent Patrice Lumumba and the Congolese people from securing their sovereignty over the copper in Katanga, the uranium mines and so on, and to prevent Lumumba from perhaps having relations with the Soviet Union, they not only overthrew in a coup d'etat Lumumba's government in 1961, but they assassinated him. 3 continents, and then many more. The coup in Brazil, 1964, against the government of Joe Goulart. The coup in Indonesia, 1965, 1 million people of the left massacred. The coup against Sukarno, which brought General Suharto into power. Coup upon coup upon coup upon coup to stop the third world from advancing a project of economic sovereignty. Friends, that's the first observation I want to make. The coup against the government of Mossadegh is part of a sequence of coups, a series of coups to block the third world's attempt to establish economic sovereignty. But there was a second reason for the coup d'etat, which I want to put on the table. And the second reason for the coup d'etat is very interesting. After the coup of 1953, the United States at the time was thinking about building a security architecture in West Asia to block what they considered to be the Soviet advance. The second observation, the coup that took place in Iran took place in 1953. That was merely 4 years after the United States established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, that was supposed to be part of the security architecture for Europe in particular. The United States, as a power interested in predominance, in dominating the world, planned to build a series of these collective security arrangements, so-called collective arrangements, although in each of them the United States was dominant. NATO was the first. Then they built the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, or the Manila Pact in 1954, that brought together countries in Southeast Asia into a United States-dominated security architecture. But in 1955, 2 years after the coup against Mossadegh, the Iranian government of the Shah and other powers in Western Asia came together at Baghdad in 1955 to create the Baghdad Pact, or the Central Treaty Organization, a military security pact including Pakistan and so on, that was essentially bringing together these countries' militaries, underwritten by their own peoples. Their own people had to pay for this military pact, but giving the advantage to the United States, which essentially dictated the terms for their so-called collective security against the Soviet Union. What this pact mentality did, this Baghdad Pact and so on, what they did was that they drove a lot of these countries, including Iran, to start spending unbelievable amounts of money on the military, building up their military forces, not to defend themselves, from some real enemy, but partly they built up their security forces to oppress their own people. That was part of the internal security doctrine of these military pacts. Partly it was, they knew that these governments were unpopular but pro-US, so they used these unpopular pro-US governments to effectively suffocate their own public by spending lots of money on the military and justifying this on the fact that they were part of an arrangement of defense against the Soviet Union and so on. Now, Mohammad Mossadegh, like Jawaharlal Nehru, like Sukarno, like Kwame Nkrumah, and others, Fidel Castro of Cuba coming later, many of them believed in non-alignment. Mr. Mossadegh was neither pro-US nor pro-Soviet. He wanted to establish the rights and place of Iran on the world stage, very keen on a kind of Iranian position in the world. These kinds of political orientations led to the creation of the non-aligned movement in Belgrade in 1961. But in fact, there was really no non-aligned Iran in 1961. There was an Iran entirely in the US camp, led by the Shah, an undemocratic government, which, because it was part of this international security architecture of the US, spent a large amount of its money on security, which really didn't mean that they were contesting the USSR or indeed Iraq or Afghanistan or any of their neighbors. But they were using that security architecture to oppress their people. And in fact, that is what becoming an ally of US imperialism in that time in particular meant. It meant you were given license to oppress your people and you were not going to be criticized at the United Nations and so on. You could have the world's largest internal security force, the SAVAK and so on, and nobody internationally would complain about human rights because you were a member of the so-called free world and you were part of a military security arrangement called the Baghdad Pact that immunized you from criticism. This second observation is important because in commemorating events such as the 70th year of the coup against Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, in commemorating that, people often talk about the resource nationalism question, the oil, nationalization of oil and so on. But what's less talked about is that Iran was trying to establish itself, like India, like Indonesia, on a footing that wasn't going to be merely an appendage of US power, but wanted to establish its own road, and that was not permitted. That was not permitted not by the Soviet Union, which backed the non-aligned posture, the non-capitalist development posture, and so on, but it was disallowed by the United States government. And the way they disallowed it in Iran was not by having an argument with Mohammad Mossadegh, not debating Mohammad Mossadegh, not trying to appeal to Mohammad Mossadegh to take another position. It was by overthrowing him. It was by conducting the coup. These are my two observations. One, the question of economic nationalism, and second, the question of being an appendage of US power. But having made these two observations, I want to end on a different note. I want to talk a little bit about what it meant in the aftermath of that coup. What it meant was the West, which publicly talked a lot about democracy and human rights, the West was quite comfortable overthrowing a democratically elected government and perfectly comfortable reinstalling or reinstating an undemocratic monarchy on the Iranian people. It was perfectly happy to allow an undemocratic monarch to take as much wealth as he wants for himself, as long as he pledges his fealty to the United States. In a sense, the aftermath of the coup created Iran as a kind of satrap, a vassal of the United States, where even though he was the Shah of Iran, he had to pledge his dominion to Washington. And then over and above that, the oppression of the Iranian people was treated as a normal fact of life. And this is partly the racism of the West, to see countries of the East not as capable of democracy, but of needing to be controlled by a strong leader, in that case, the Shah of Iran. At any time, these people like the Shah could be turned against. And that indeed is what happened in different moments in world history, where those who had cozied up to the West then became disposable. Friends, I've given you a sense of my observations regarding the coup d'etat 70 years ago in Iran. I could very well have been speaking about the coup d'etat 50 years ago against the government of Salvador Allende in Chile, from where I'm addressing you. These are all the same. They're all coups against the third world. We need to know this history, understand this history, in order to understand well the structure of imperialism, which we are all, in our different ways, trying to overcome. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.